An old man stands in the cool night air of the ancient Near East, his sandals sinking into the loose dust. This is the genesis of a pattern. A voice speaks in the dark. A guarantee is handed to a people. The descendants of David, the royal line carrying the ultimate promise of God, are bound in heavy bronze shackles. The air reeks of roasting cedar, as Solomon's magnificent temple, the literal resting place of God's earthly presence, burns to the ground. The sacred gold is hacked apart with axes. The priests are slaughtered. The crown is stripped. The people are marched hundreds of miles east. Their feet bleed onto the desert road. They are dragged into the sprawling, idol-choked streets of Babylon, and they sit by the rivers and hang up their harps. They refuse to sing. You can hear the chains dragging against the stone. The throne is empty. The temple is a crater. The nation is a ghost. If you are an Israelite sitting in the Babylonian dirt, you are forced to conclude one of two things. Either the Babylonian gods are stronger, or Yahweh has finally reached the limit of his hesed and ripped up the covenant, the heavy dabar. That immovable object dropped into history under the stars with Abraham appears to be permanently buried under the rubble of Jerusalem. But this is where human logic profoundly misunderstands the divine architecture. We assume that when the visible structures of faith collapse, the promise has failed. We assume that if the temple burns, God has abandoned the scene. We look at the ruins of our own expectations and assume the contract is void, who have no power to bring it to pass. A covenant is cut, often in the literal blood of severed animals. The exile is not the death of the word. It is the demolition of everything they trusted instead of the word. God is willing to let the physical throne burn to ashes to keep his people from worshiping the cedar instead of the king. The promise survives the fire because the promise was never anchored to the real estate of Jerusalem. It was anchored to the sheer, unilateral loyalty of the one who spoke it. Yet the Old Testament does not end with a massive, triumphant resolution. It ends with a fragile remnant returning to a fractured city, building a smaller temple, and waiting. And then, 400 years of deafening silence fall over the Middle East. No prophets speak. The sky turns to iron. The waiting stretches until the political landscape is completely swallowed by the brutal, marching boots of the Roman Empire. The Hebrew scriptures close on an aching, unresolved chord. But that echo does not stop in the ruins, because centuries later, a Jewish scholar named Paul sits down to write a letter to a chaotic church in Corinth. He is about to explain how every single ancient guarantee from the stars of Abraham to the throne of David is finally resolved. And to do it, he reaches for a specific Greek word that changes the entire nature of the transaction. It happens under the stars in Hebron. It happens on a mountain wrapped in blinding smoke. It happens in... The Roman Empire ran on a very specific kind of legal machinery. The entire system, from the bustling marketplace in Corinth to the marble floors of the Senate in Rome, was built on the Latin principle of do des. I give, so that you might give. You perform a service. I pay the wage. You offer the correct sacrifice. The gods provide the rain. It was a world of bilateral contracts, sealed in hot wax and enforced by the sharp edge of a Roman sword. And this is the exact environment where a Jewish scholar named Paul sits down. The smell of ink and dry papyrus in the room, to write to a chaotic group of believers in Corinth. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 20, he talks about all the ancient guarantees God made in the Old Testament. And the word he chooses for promise completely subverts the Roman legal framework. The word Paul uses is the Greek EPANGELIA. It appears over 50 times in the New Testament. And its background in the ancient Greek-speaking world is critical. A Roman citizen would not typically use EPANGELIA for a standard business contract. For a mutual agreement between two equal parties, they would use the word syntheke. But EPANGELIA carried a different weight. It was often used in the Greco-Roman world to describe an imperial edict, a cedar throne room in Jerusalem. Same structure, again and again. Most people assume the promises of God, a public announcement, or a unilateral pledge made by a sovereign ruler to a city. When a king issued an EPANGELIA, there was no negotiation. You did not sit across a heavy wooden table and haggle over the terms. A royal herald simply walked into a crowded stone square, unrolled a scroll, and loudly announced what the king had unilaterally decided to do. Paul leans on this exact distinction in his letter to the Galatians, pointing out that God's EPANGELIA to Abraham came 430 years before the law was given at Sinai. The law was a conditional system. The law required mutual performance. But the promise was an unconditional decree. That linguistic root changes everything about how we read the New Testament. When we approach God, we naturally default to the Roman system of do, ut. We bring our performance, our church attendance, our good behavior, and we attempt to negotiate a syntheke. We try to trade our obedience for his blessing. We treat prayer like a courtroom negotiation, offering to do better tomorrow if he will just fix our problem today. But heaven does not deal in contracts. The EPANGELIA is not a negotiated settlement. It is a royal gift. God is not looking for a business partner to co-sign an agreement. He is acting as a sovereign who has already decided to bankrupt his own treasury for the sake of his people. Scattered throughout Scripture are a collection of individual, disconnected guarantees, a divine vending machine of comfort. You put in. The guarantee rests entirely on the authority of the one speaking, not the performance of the one receiving. But the detail that changes how you read the rest of the Bible is where Paul says all these ancient decrees finally land. Paul sits in a dimly lit room in Macedonia. The air is cold. The apostle is exhausted. His body carries the physical scars of Roman whips and violent stone-throwing mobs. He dips a reed pen into a small clay inkwell. The crushed gallnuts smell sharp and bitter in the damp room. He presses the black ink onto a sheet of rough papyrus. He is writing to a church that is fracturing, a community in Corinth that is doubting his authority and questioning God's faithfulness. And right there in the first chapter, he writes a single sentence that completely redefines the architecture of the entire Bible. For all the promises of God find their yes in him. Look at the sheer, overwhelming volume of that statement. The promise of a crushed serpent in an ancient garden. The promise of descendants numbering like the stars. The promise of a prophet greater than Moses. The promise of an eternal throne for the line of David. The right amount of faith. The correct formula of obedience. The proper sequence of prayer. And outcomes. The promise of a new heart in the book of Ezekiel. They do not run parallel to each other. They converge. Every single guarantee spoken by God funnels down through centuries of blood, exile, and deafening silence. They do not scatter. They narrow. They point to one specific coordinate in space and time, landing entirely on the shoulders of a Jewish rabbi from Nazareth. The day bar takes on lungs and vocal cords. The word becomes flesh and walks out into the dirt. Jesus steps into the Jordan River. He fasts for 40 days in the scorching wilderness and does not rebel. He walks into the temple courts and declares himself greater than the cedar and the gold. He hangs on a Roman execution rack, his blood dripping onto the Judean soil, and absorbs the full penalty for every time humanity broke the terms of the covenant. The Old Testament promises are not a catalog of individual blessings waiting to be claimed. They are a singular map pointing to a singular king. If the ancient promise was about a piece of land in the Middle East, Jesus expands it to inherit the entire earth. If the promise was about a physical throne in Jerusalem, Jesus ascends to the right hand of the creator of the cosmos, the specific provision you requested. A promise for your finances. A promise for your physical healing. A promise for God did not forget a single word spoken to Abraham or David. He fulfilled them in a way so massive that the original hearers could not have possibly comprehended the scale. The yes Paul is writing about is not a divine stamp of approval on human desires. It is a person. Jesus is the true temple. He is the true Israel. He is the final, unshakable reality that all the ancient shadows were merely projecting. When God said yes to his own covenant, he did not send a renewed contract. He sent his Son. The funnel works perfectly when it points toward the cross. But a profound spiritual crisis happens when you take that ancient funnel, carry it into the modern world, and attempt to turn it completely upside down. You walk into a modern bookstore, the smell of roasted coffee, masking the scent of freshly printed paper, and you see shelves lined with daily devotionals. Glossy covers wrapped in elegant cursive fonts promise you favor, breakthrough, an unprecedented financial blessing. You scroll through social media at 2 in the morning, the harsh blue light illuminating a dark bedroom, and you see ancient verses pasted over mountain landscapes telling you that God is about to promote you, your career trajectory. And so we harvest the text, plucking verses out of their context to paste on refrigerators. We have taken the ancient funnel of fulfillment and violently inverted it. Instead of all the promises of God pointing toward the person of Jesus, we have decided that all the promises of God point toward us. We take a letter written by the prophet Jeremiah to a group of weeping, traumatized refugees sitting in the dirt of Babylon, where God says, "I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you." And we lift that verse out of the ash and rubble of the ancient Near East. We staple it to our college applications, our business proposals, and our retirement accounts. We completely ignore the fact that in the very same chapter, God explicitly told those exiles they were going to live and die in Babylon and would have to wait 70 years for rescue. Jeremiah 29 is not a guarantee of a seamless modern life. It is a survival manual for a brutal exile. When you build your theology entirely on isolated verses ripped from their historical bedrock, you are constructing a phantom guarantee. You are forcing the creator of the cosmos to co-sign a synthec, a contract he never actually agreed to. And the tragedy of this modern framework is what happens when the medical biopsy comes back positive, when the marriage finally fractures, or when the bank forecloses on the house. If your faith is anchored to a promise God never made, your faith will shatter when that promise inevitably fails. And dashboard mirrors, waiting for God to fulfill our personal definitions of blessing. But if you look closer, you will sit in a sterile hospital waiting room, the chemical smell of bleach burning your lungs, and you will conclude that heaven has abandoned you. You will think the covenant is broken, but heaven did not abandon you. You simply expected the delivery of a package that the dabber never actually contained. Jesus did not endure a Roman execution rack to guarantee your upward mobility in a Western democracy. He absorbed the wrath of the covenant to secure your eternal presence in his kingdom. The yes Paul writes about in Corinthians means that every spiritual blessing, every ounce of mercy required to wipe your slate clean, and every guarantee of a future bodily resurrection has been irreversibly secured in his blood. The heavy word spoken to Abraham was always marching toward the salvation of the world, not the temporary comfort of the individual. But that does not mean the physical world stays broken forever. Because while the promises find their anchor in the 1st century, their ultimate fulfillment requires an entirely new sky. An old man sits on a jagged rock in the Aegean Sea. The salt spray stings his face. The waves crash violently against the black stone. It is the end of the 1st century. He is the last living apostle, exiled to a prison colony on the island of Patmos, his body frail and scarred by decades of persecution. He is surrounded by the crushing weight of the Roman Empire, a system that demands absolute worship, at the ancient language beneath the English ink, at the sheer, terrifying weight of what actually happens. And then, the sky rips wide open. A voice sounds like a deafening waterfall. A vision invades his sight. The old, blood-soaked earth begins to fracture and fade. The oceans, the ancient biblical symbol for chaos, monsters, and death completely disappear, and a city descends. The architecture is impossible. Walls of blazing jasper, streets of gold, so pure they look like transparent glass. 12 gates, carved from single, massive pearls. John writes down what he sees. He records the climax of every single promise ever spoken in the dark. The heavy debar, dropped into the dirt, with Abraham is finally fully mature. The unilateral Hesed sworn to Israel finally reaches its destination. The royal EPANGELIA decreed by Paul finally takes physical, touchable shape. Every ancient shadow becomes solid reality. The chains of Egypt are entirely forgotten. The ashes of Babylon are swept away by the wind. The agonizing silence of the 400 years is swallowed by the singing of a multitude no one can count. John hears a loud voice shouting from the throne, "Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them." God steps fully into the physical world. He reaches out with his own hands. He touches the weathered, exhausted faces of his people, looking up at a sky thick with stars. The wind pulls at his heavy woolen cloak. He has no hair. When the creator of the universe binds himself to a fragile, failing creature, you start to see something. He physically wipes away every single tear from their eyes. The sound of mourning goes completely silent. The grip of death is permanently broken. The curse of the garden is reversed. The ultimate promise of Scripture is not an evacuation plan. It is a collision. Heaven does not snatch us away as formless ghosts to float on clouds. The creator of the cosmos brings his throne down to the dirt. He rebuilds the earth. He restores the physical world to its original, uncorrupted glory. The word spoken in the dark finally breaks into blinding daylight. But as John stares at the impossible architecture of this new city, he notices something shocking. He looks for the center of the ancient Jewish faith. He looks for the cedar and the gold. He looks for the exact building the Babylonians burned to the ground and the Romans tore apart. But it is not there. There is a massive, glaring absence in the middle of the New Jerusalem. John looks for a temple in the New Jerusalem, and he does not find one. He does not find it, because the Lord God Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. The shadow is gone, because the substance has finally arrived. The vending machine theology completely misses. The promises of God are not scattered contracts for personal comfort. An old man stood under the stars with a barren wife, and a heavy word was dropped into history that outlasted empires. A family suffered 400 years in Egyptian chains, and the agonizing gap proved they could not save themselves. A generation molded a golden calf in the desert sand, and a fierce, unilateral loyalty refused to break the covenant. A royal city burned to ashes in Babylon, and the guarantee survived the fire because it was never anchored to the cedar. A Roman world operated on negotiated contracts, and a sovereign king issued a royal decree that required no human performance. A Jewish rabbi bled on an execution rack, and every scattered, ancient prophecy funneled down into a singular, irreversible yes. An exiled apostle watched the oceans completely disappear, and the creator of the cosmos finally brought his throne down to the dirt. One thread, one unstoppable march. But maybe the part that stays with me most is the exile. The image of those heavy bronze shackles and the smoke rising from the crater of Jerusalem. We look at the ash of our own lives and assume heaven has walked away. We assume that when the visible structures of our faith collapse, the promise has failed. But the destruction of the temple, they are a singular, unstoppable march toward a collision. The real question of all these ancient texts was not the death of the Word. It was the demolition of everything they trusted instead of the Word. If you are in a season where the waiting has stretched into agonizing years, where the silence feels like a breached contract, or where you are sitting in a sterile room holding a phantom guarantee that just shattered, you need to remember the ancient weight of a debar. The delay is not an abandonment. It is a formation. You do not have to hold the promise together with your own anxiety, because the promise does not require your emotional equilibrium to exist. It stands on its own mass. It holds you. And may the God who has never once abandoned his Hesed walk with you through the deafening silence of your own waiting, and bring you into a final reality far more solid than anything you could have manufactured on your own. Which promise can I claim for my situation today? It's this. What is the one thing God is actually binding himself to do? Because if you misunderstand the nature of the promise, you will spend your life waiting for a delivery that was never ordered. You will experience the natural delays of life as divine abandonment. You will read the silence of heaven as the failure of God. you will build a theology of disappointment. The answer to this question changes how you read every single guarantee from Genesis to Revelation. To find it, you cannot just look at what is promised. You have to look at the raw material of how the promise is made. You have to understand what happens to the physical world when God simply opens his mouth. His wife is barren, her womb a closed door for decades. He is surrounded by nations that sacrifice their children. A signature at the bottom of a legal document is an incredibly fragile thing. We live in an era where a guarantee is only as strong as the ink on the page, the collateral backing the loan, or the courtroom willing to enforce it. We assume a word spoken into the thin air is the weakest possible form of assurance, a vibration that evaporates the second it leaves a person's lungs. But the ancient scribes who recorded these texts did not view reality through that lens. To them, language was not just a tool for communication. It was the scaffolding of the cosmos. Go back to that dark, windy night with the old man under the stars. The text in Genesis chapter 15, verse 1, frames the entire encounter with a very specific, structural phrase. The author writes, "After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision, saying, 'Do not be afraid.'" The term our English Bibles translate as word here is the Hebrew dabar. It appears over 2,000 times in the Old Testament, and its range of meaning completely shatters our modern, Western categories of language. We tend to think of a word as a sound, a unit of vocabulary, a symbol pointing to a reality outside of itself. But in biblical Hebrew, dabar does not just mean word, to silent gods of stone and wood. And a voice has just told him that his descendants will. It is frequently translated as matter, affair, or thing. It is not simply the description of a reality, it is the reality itself. When God speaks in the ancient Hebrew mind, he does not just relay vocabulary. He releases something heavy into the physical world. This is the exact concept operating in the opening lines of Genesis. When the Creator forms the oceans and the mountains, not with his hands, but with his mouth. The dabar carries the structural integrity of a physical object. The spoken word possesses actual, immovable mass. That linguistic root changes everything about how we read this midnight encounter. When God makes a promise to Abram, he is not merely forecasting a future event or offering a gentle reassurance. The dabar is not a prediction. It is a physical substance injected into human history. We tend to treat the promises of God like delicate, fragile wishes that require our constant emotional energy to keep them alive. We secretly believe that if our faith wavers, if our anxiety spikes in the middle of the night, the promise will dissolve back into the air. But a dabar does not require your emotional equilibrium to exist. It stands on its own weight. Outnumber the blazing lights scattered across the black canvas above him. He cannot see the centuries ahead. It is an immovable object placed in the center of the timeline, forcing all subsequent historical events to bend around its gravity. It absolutely does not matter if Abram wakes up the next morning feeling terrified in his tent. The thing has been spoken. The mass has been dropped into the dirt. If a divine promise carries that much sheer, physical weight, you would naturally expect the fulfillment to be instantaneous. You would expect the earth to shake, the barren womb to immediately open, and the reality to manifest before the old man could even tie his sandals. But that is exactly what does not happen. The morning sun rises over Hebron. The tent flap opens. The old man looks at his wife. She is still barren. The next day arrives. The exact same silence. A year passes. A decade passes. 2 decades evaporate into the desert wind. Bodies age. Hair turns white. Skin wrinkles like old parchment. The heavy dabar, that immovable object dropped into history, seems completely invisible in the harsh daylight. 25 years drag by in the dirt. 25 years of waking up in a quiet tent. 25 years of neighboring tribes laughing at the wandering herdsman, who claims the creator of the stars made him a father of nations. He waits. He panics. He tries to manufacture the promise with his own hands. He cannot see the 400 years of slavery his people will endure in Egypt. He cannot see using an Egyptian servant girl. It fractures his family. It shatters the peace of his camp. And then, only when all biological hope is clinically dead, an infant finally cries in the dark. But the pattern of delay does not stop with Abraham. It accelerates. The promised family grows. They travel south to Egypt to survive a brutal famine. The pharaohs change. The hospitality rots into hostility. Chains are locked onto wrists. Whips crack across sweating backs. Mud and straw are trampled into bricks under the merciless North African sun. The smell of garlic and sweat fills the labor camps. A year of slavery. A decade of slavery. A century of slavery. 400 years pass. 400 years of screaming out to a silent sky. 400 years of watching children born into bondage. 400 years of burying grandfathers in foreign dirt. Where is the heavy word? Where is the unshakable guarantee? The people assume the gap means God has forgotten. They assume the silence means the contract has been abandoned. But the gap is not an accident. The delay is not a malfunction in the divine calendar. It is a necessary architecture. Look at the pattern. God makes the promise. God waits until the recipient is entirely powerless to bring it about. God delivers the reality. The 400 years are not a punishment. They are a crucible. The waiting is not an empty space. It is a formation. The delay forces a stubborn, fragile people to realize they cannot save themselves. The golden temple burning to the ground in Babylon. He only has a spoken guarantee hanging in the silence. If the promise of freedom arrives immediately, human hands take the credit. If the promise arrives after 4 centuries of chains, only heaven gets the glory. The massive, agonizing gap between the word and the fulfillment is the very thing that proves the power of the one who spoke. But human beings break under the weight of the gap. Even after the sea splits, even after the chains fall off, Israel cannot handle the waiting. Moses climbs a smoking mountain. The people wait at the bottom, and within exactly 40 days, they are molding a golden calf in the sand. They complain about the manna that tastes like honey. They beg to go back to the whips of Egypt because at least the slavery was predictable. They break the terms of the relationship before the stone tablets even make it down the mountain. By every metric of ancient Near Eastern law, the contract is breached. The promise should be voided. The fire should consume them. And to understand why heaven doesn't walk away, you have to look at one specific word embedded deep in the law. The book of Deuteronomy is a long, heavy speech delivered to a new generation, standing in the white-hot sand on the edge of the Jordan River. Their parents died in the wilderness. The bitter scent of the burning golden calf is still etched into their collective historical memory. He is asked to believe the impossible based on absolutely nothing but the character of the one speaking. They know their own capacity for sabotage, and Moses looks at them in chapter 7, verse 9, and tells them that God keeps his covenant and his steadfast love to 1,000 generations. The English translation here is polite, almost fragile. The word underneath it is the Hebrew hesed. It is arguably the most untranslatable word in the ancient world. Our modern English Bibles scramble to capture its weight, fracturing it across the pages into words like mercy, loving kindness, or unfailing love. But hesed is not primarily an emotional term. It is a legal, structural, covenantal reality. It describes a fierce, unilateral loyalty that operates entirely independent of the other party's performance. In the ancient Near East, when 2 kings made a treaty, the loyalty was always conditional. If the lesser king stopped paying tribute, the swords came out. If the terms were broken, the contract was burned. But the covenant God cut with Abraham, and later extended to Israel, was asymmetrical. Hesed is not a warm sentiment that fluctuates with the behavior of the beloved. It is a stubborn, structural refusal to walk away. It is the lock clicking shut on a heavy iron gate from the inside. It is the exact word the prophet Hosea uses centuries later when God tells him to walk into a filthy slave market, hand over cold silver, and buy back his own unfaithful wife. When God operates in hesed, He is binding his own sacred reputation to the survival and redemption. No legal contract is signed. No physical down payment is given in the moment. Only breath moving through the air, of a people who cannot stop tearing their own house apart. If the idea of a God who tethers himself to you when you cannot, hold on to him, is stirring something in your chest, you're exactly who this channel is for. Drop a thought in the comments and hit subscribe, because every week we dig past the English translations into the raw, unyielding bedrock of the text. So the ancient Israelites cross the river into the land. They build their cities. They crown their kings. They construct a massive stone temple in Jerusalem, and the air fills with the smell of roasting meat and burning frankincense. And the prophets begin to speak about a final, ultimate promise, a descendant of David who will sit on the throne forever, bringing justice to a fractured world. But a unilateral promise creates a terrifying problem for justice. If God refuses to walk away from his hesed, what happens when the people's rebellion becomes so violent, so toxic, that the land itself begins to rot? God cannot simply ignore the blood on the hands of the kings. He cannot overlook the corruption in the temple. The tension between God's absolute justice and his unyielding hesed stretches until the wood splinters. And then, the unthinkable happens. The promise appears to completely die. The heavy wooden gates of Jerusalem splinter under the Babylonian battering ram. Dust and ash choke the summer air. It is 586 BC, and the unthinkable has arrived.